The snow was falling the night she decided to stop waiting. 6 years of silence, 6 years of promises whispered and broken. Now Winifred Harcourt was ready to leave everything behind. The whispers, the pride, and the man who once swore he would return. But as her carriage rolled into the storm, a horse thundered down the frozen road behind her, and the Marquis who had let her go was no longer the same man. A love buried by duty is about to rise from the ashes of scandal. Will it be redemption or ruin? Subscribe now and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more breathtaking period romances filled with emotion, secrets, and unforgettable passion. The Cotswolds, England, 1817. The winter air held a clean, merciless cold as the carriage wheels bit into the hard-packed road, and Winifred Harcourt kept her hands folded in her lap as if composure could be stitched into the body like a seam. The lanterns swinging outside the market town assembly rooms shone through a faint mist, turning the night into something softly gilded, almost forgiving. Almost. Inside, warmth waited behind tall doors and polished wood, behind the glow of hundreds of candles mirrored in glass and laughter. Yet even before she entered, Winifred could feel what always greeted her first. Eyes. Not cruel ones. Not always. Many were merely curious, accustomed to weighing a woman as if she were a bolt of fabric that might be purchased or dismissed. Others carried that particular village confidence, which came from believing they had watched her story long enough to own it. Her father offered his arm as they stepped down from the carriage, and his grip was gentle but firm, as though he could shield her from the oldest danger of all, being spoken of as if she were not present. "You look very fine, Mr." Harcourt murmured, his voice careful with pride. Winifred smiled, the expression softening her face without surrendering a single inch of her strength. "You will make the matrons jealous, Papa, if you go on." He gave a quiet huff that might have been laughter. "Let them. I should like them jealous for once." She entered the assembly rooms in her dove-blue gown, the fabric falling in a clean Regency line from the high waist, modest and elegant without proclaiming for admiration. A narrow ribbon under the bust, a shade darker than the winter sky, drew the eye to the steadiness of her posture. Her hair, chestnut and thick, had been arranged into a neat chignon with soft curls at her temples, those tendrils that the fashion plates suggested were effortless, and that every woman knew required patience and pins. A simple reticule hung from her wrist, and at her throat a small cameo rested, plain enough to pass unnoticed by those who did not look closely. And she had learned, over 6 long years, who looked closely. Music drifted through the room, light as champagne, and the floor shone with the reflection of dancers moving through a country set. Winifred and her father paused at the threshold, an entrance that in other lives might have felt like triumph. Here it felt like being judged by a book cover written in someone else's hand. The vicar's wife approached with a smile polished to perfection, her bonnet ribbons tied with moral certainty. "Miss Harcourt," she said, as though the title itself were a fragile thing. "How charming to see you, and Mr. Harcourt, of course. We were just saying how brisk the weather has been." "We must be grateful for health enough to feel it," Mr. Harcourt replied, in the tone of a man who knew how to parry without drawing blood. "Indeed, indeed." The vicar's wife's gaze swept Winifred, pausing where the cameo lay. "Your gown is very suitable." Suitable, not lovely, not radiant. Suitable was what one said when one refused to acknowledge beauty that did not belong to the approved. Winifred did not flinch. "Thank you, Mrs. Elwood. I find the colour cheerful in winter." "Oh," a small blink. "Yes, cheer is important." Mrs. Elwood drifted away, leaving a wake of murmurs like perfume. Winifred felt her father's hand tighten around her arm. "You are steady as a mast," he said under his breath. "And just as admired," she murmured, and he pressed his lips together because he understood the joke was not meant to be funny. They moved farther into the room. Winifred offered polite greetings, accepted compliments that arrived in careful portions, and refused to let her eyes go searching. She knew better than to look as though she were waiting for anyone. Still, she felt it, like a change in pressure before a storm, a subtle shift, as though the air itself had learned a new posture. The doors at the far end opened. The Marquis of Ashford entered as if the room had been built to receive him. He did not stride. He did not announce himself. He simply arrived, and the space made room in a way that had nothing to do with friendliness and everything to do with recognition. Tall, dark-coated, with his cravat tied impeccably white against a charcoal tailcoat, he was the kind of man people trusted before he had spoken a word, a man taught from boyhood that calm was power. Winifred kept her gaze steady forward. She had practiced that steadiness at mirrors until it became muscle memory, yet she saw him without looking, the way one could feel the sun through closed eyelids. He took his usual position near the wall, where a marquis could watch without appearing to watch, and where no one could accuse him of seeking anyone's company too eagerly. The candlelight found his face in gentle strokes, sharpening the line of his jaw, turning the grey-blue of his eyes into something almost silver. He was not smiling. He was never smiling at these gatherings until he found her. And when his gaze settled on her, the room's noise seemed to move farther away, as if her heart had stepped forward and demanded silence. Winifred lifted her chin the slightest fraction, not as an invitation, not as a plea, only as acknowledgement that she was not invisible. The orchestra began another set. Couples formed lines, laughter rose, a fan fluttered somewhere like wings. Mr. Harcourt was drawn into conversation by an acquaintance, and Winifred found herself standing with a small circle of women who spoke quickly about the weather, the latest London fashion plates, the price of sugar, and the moral benefits of patience, all while their eyes kept drifting to what mattered, to the wall, to the man who watched. An older woman, kindly but careless, leaned in as if confiding a secret. "He is always so attentive," she murmured, meaning it as comfort, not understanding the knife hidden inside it. "How fortunate you are, dear." "Fortunate?" Winifred smiled politely. "How fortunate we all are to have such good music tonight." She excused herself with grace and moved toward the refreshment table, where she could pretend the reason she stood alone was thirst rather than circumstance. A gentleman stepped into her path. Mr. Pritchard, she thought, one of those men who believed charming was a weapon and that women were targets. His coat was fashionable, his smile was practiced, his eyes lingered too long. "Miss Harcourt," he said, bowing just enough to be proper, "may I claim the honor of the next dance?" Winifred's fingers tightened around her reticule cord. She felt the room's attention sharpen, not because she mattered, but because her answer would serve someone else's amusement. "I am promised," she replied, with calm she did not fully feel. His smile widened, as if he had caught her in a lie. "To whom?" "I confess I have not seen you accept any gentleman's hand this evening." "I seldom accept a first offer," she said softly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy were a privilege he could steal. "Or perhaps you are waiting for a particular offer, a title, perhaps." Heat rose behind her ribs, not with shame, but with anger so controlled it felt like ice. Before she could answer, a subtle movement occurred near the doorway. Not a shout, not a grand interruption, merely a quiet authority turning toward them. The Marquis of Ashford spoke to his steward, just 2 words too low to carry. The steward nodded and crossed the room with efficient purpose. "Sir," the steward said to Mr. Pritchard, with the courteous firmness reserved for men who needed correction, "there is a message for you at the entrance. Urgent." Mr. Pritchard frowned. "Now?" The steward's expression did not change. "Yes, sir." Mr. Pritchard hesitated, then forced a smile at Winifred as if generosity belonged to him. "Another time, Miss Harcourt." "Perhaps," she said, and watched him leave, his pride bruised in a way only he could recognize. Winifred kept her face composed. She did not look toward the wall, but she felt it again, the steady weight of a gaze that had defended her without touching her, protection without claiming. The set ended. People shifted and regrouped. Winifred moved toward a quieter corner near the tall windows, where frost traced delicate veins along the edges of the glass, and the night beyond looked endless and indifferent. Her breath did not fog the window. The room was too warm for that. But something inside her felt cold anyway. "Miss Harcourt?" His voice was low, controlled, and familiar enough to be dangerous. She turned, and there he was at her shoulder, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of fatigue beneath his eyes, close enough that she could smell winter air clinging to his coat, as if he had brought the night in with him. In public, he did not say her given name. In public, he was careful. "Lord Ashford," she replied, and the title sounded like a distance. His gaze slid over her face, searching for cracks. "Are you well?" She could have laughed. She could have cried. Instead, she kept her voice level. As well as any woman standing alone in a crowded room. A flicker crossed his expression. Pain, quickly restrained. "I saw Mr. Pritchard trouble you." "You saw," she repeated, the word landing softly and heavily at once. Ernest's hands were clasped behind his back, the posture of a man trained never to appear desperate. Yet there was tension in the line of his shoulders, as though every muscle were holding something back. "I had him removed," he said. "Yes." Her eyes met his, hazel catching the candlelight. "You always do." He exhaled, quiet enough that no one else would hear. "Winifred." The private name slipped out like an accident, and the sound of it struck her heart with such force she had to steady herself with the edge of the window ledge. His voice became even lower, intimate without being improper. "Forgive me. I did not mean—" "You mean it when you say it," she whispered, and her restraint trembled for a moment. "That is the tragedy of it." His eyes tightened as if the truth physically hurt. "I came as soon as I could." "You always come," she said. "That has never been the question." He looked toward the room, toward the dancers, the laughter, the women who would smile at him and sharpen their gossip with the same breath. His jaw worked once, as though he were swallowing words too heavy to speak here. "I cannot—" he began. Winifred's gaze did not soften. "I know what you cannot do, my lord. I have known it for 6 years." A silence pressed between them, filled with music and everything unsaid. His eyes returned to hers, and for a heartbeat the Marquis fell away, and the man appeared, tired, earnest, and so deeply, achingly human. "I am trying," he said. The words were simple, but the way he spoke them made them sound like a confession. "You must believe that I am trying." Winifred felt her throat tighten. Trying. Always trying. As if love were a staircase he intended to climb someday, once the weather was favorable and the world agreed. "Trying is what you ask of me," she said quietly. "Always." His mouth parted, as if he might finally say something reckless, something honest. Instead he lowered his gaze to her gloved hand. Not touching. Never touching in public. Yet his eyes looked as though he could feel the warmth of her through kid leather. "Soon," he said. The words struck like a slap wrapped in velvet. Winifred's breath caught, and for a fraction of a second she saw herself as the village saw her. The woman who waited, the woman who endured, the woman who smiled while her life was postponed. The ballroom blurred at the edges. The candles seemed too bright. The music sounded far away. "Soon," she repeated, tasting bitterness. Ernest's voice softened, desperate in a way only she would recognize. "I swear it." Winifred looked at him, truly looked, at the impeccable tie of his cravat, at the fine wool of his coat, at the way his restraint was not indifference, but fear dressed as discipline. She could see how carefully he had built his life around duty, how every brick of his composure had been laid to keep disaster out. And she could see, with sudden clarity, what his caution had cost her. "You should dance," he said, as though offering her a kindness. It would silence them. Her lips curved, not in amusement, but in something sharper. "With whom, my lord?" His eyes flickered, and for a moment it seemed as though the answer rose in him like a tide. With me. But he did not say it. He only looked at her, and the longing there was so intense it made her heart ache with a tenderness she no longer trusted. "I cannot," he said again, quieter, and the room carried on around them as though her world had not just narrowed to a single painful truth. Winifred inhaled slowly. The air tasted of wax and roses and winter wool. She held her composure like a lit candle in wind. "Then I will not dance," she replied, and the gentleness of her voice made the refusal more devastating. Ernest's gaze sharpened. "Do not punish yourself for your fear," she finished, and then regretted it because his face tightened as if struck. A beat, another. He looked as though he might reach for her, not with his hand, but with words. Yet the room was full of watching eyes. "I did not come tonight to wound you," he said, his voice controlled again, because control was what the world demanded of him. "And I did not come tonight to be wounded," she answered, the truth slipping free before she could stop it. He stared, and something in his expression shifted, alarm, as if he sensed a door moving where it had always stood open. "Winifred," he murmured, her name in private again, soft as prayer. She lowered her gaze, not in submission, but to keep herself from breaking in front of him. "My lord," she said carefully, "you have always been kind." His breath hitched, because he understood the danger of that sentence. Kindness was what people praised when they had nothing else to offer. She lifted her eyes to his once more, and her voice became quiet enough that only he could hear. "But kindness is not a life." For a moment, Ernest looked as though the entire room had disappeared, and only she remained. His eyes darkened with emotion he could not permit himself to show. "If you knew how he began. Winifred shook her head slightly, a small motion, but final. "Do not here, not like this," because she could not bear another confession wrapped in restraint. Another promise made of air. A couple drifted near, laughing, and Ernest stepped back by instinct, restoring distance as if distance were virtue. He gave a stiff bow, all propriety and control. "Miss Harcourt." It was as though he had placed a glass wall between them. Winifred returned the smallest curtsy, her spine straight. "Lord Ashford." He lingered one heartbeat longer, his gaze holding hers as if he were trying to memorize the shape of her face. Then he turned, and once again he was the Marquis by the wall, the nobleman who watched from the edges as though the centre did not belong to him. Winifred remained by the window, her reflection faint in the dark glass, her breath steady, her hands still. Inside her chest, something shifted with a quiet, irrevocable sound. Not anger, not hysterics, decision. When her father returned, his expression questioning, she smiled and spoke of the music, of the warmth, of the pleasant company. She played her role with the elegance she had learned to wear like armor, and when they left the assembly rooms at last, and the cold night wrapped her again, she breathed it in as if it might cleanse her. The carriage rolled back toward the village, past hedgerows stiff with frost and fields sleeping under winter. Her father dozed beside her, exhaustion softening his features. Winifred looked out at the darkness and watched the lantern light bob across the road like a small, stubborn hope. In her lap, her gloved hand closed around her reticule cord until she felt the bite of it. 6 years, she thought, not with bitterness, but with a clarity so sharp it felt like mercy. 6 years of soon. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply stared into the winter night and understood, with a calm that frightened her, that she could not live her entire life in the space between a promise and a claim. The village would wake tomorrow and continue telling her story as if it were theirs. But for the first time, Winifred Harcourt felt the beginning of something else, her own. The morning after the ball was grey and still, a kind of quiet that seemed to echo through the small stone cottages of the Cotswolds, as though even the hills themselves were listening for something that never came. The frost had not yet lifted from the hedgerows, and Winifred Harcourt sat near the window of her modest parlour, her sewing untouched in her lap. The needle had stopped halfway through a stitch, frozen as her thoughts wandered where they should not. Her father had gone early to the estate for a meeting with the steward. The house, though tidy and warm, felt empty without his steady presence. From the window, she could see the faint trail of smoke rising from the chimneys of the village, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing as it always did. The baker's boy delivering bread, the vicar's wife walking briskly toward the church, the sound of a cart creaking over the cobblestones, everything unchanged, everything predictable, and yet within her, nothing felt the same. She had returned from the assembly the night before with the echo of Ernest's voice still pressed against her memory, the way he had said her name, the way his eyes had searched hers as if begging for understanding without daring to ask for forgiveness. For 6 years that voice had been her comfort. Now it was the sound of her prison. Winifred set the needle aside and closed her hands tightly in her lap. 6 years, she whispered to the empty room. 6 years of waiting for a promise to stop sounding like a dream. Outside, the faint clip of hooves broke the morning calm. Her breath caught, foolishly hoping it might be him. But when she turned her gaze toward the lane, it was only the post-rider, his cloak dark with dew. The disappointment was small, sharp, and familiar. She rose and moved toward the fire, feeding it another piece of coal. The warmth spread slowly, reaching her fingers as if reluctant. She wondered if Ernest had already left for London again. He often did this time of year, under the pretext of managing accounts or attending to Parliament sessions, and every time he left, the village filled the silence he left behind with words of their own. She could hear them still, whispers carried like wind through open windows. He will never marry her. She has waited too long. Perhaps she enjoys the attention. A marquis needs a fortune, not affection. They were not cruel, not always. Some pitied her sincerely, others envied the small glimpses of tenderness they had witnessed. A carriage stopping near her gate on a rainy day, a bouquet of winter roses delivered without a name, a marquis lowering his head slightly whenever she passed him in church. To the village, these gestures were evidence of a mystery. To Winifred, they had become the slow unraveling of her youth. That afternoon, her father returned, brushing snow from his coat. His cheeks were pink from the cold, his hands rough from work, once meant for younger men. "You are quiet, my dear," he said as he hung his hat. "Is your head troubling you?" "No, Papa," she replied gently. "Only my thoughts." He nodded, weary. Thoughts can be heavier than any burden, especially when they are not shared. She smiled faintly, unwilling to trouble him. "I have learned to carry them lightly." But Mr. Harcourt saw the change in her eyes. "You are much like your mother," he murmured, seating himself by the fire. She had the same patience that made people call her strong, when in truth it was the patience of someone afraid to break. Winifred turned toward him, startled. Was she afraid? "Once," he said softly, "before she learned that peace is not given, it is chosen." The fire crackled between them. Winifred looked into it, as if her mother's reflection might appear there, whispering the truth she had not dared to face. That evening, a carriage arrived at the Harcourt gate. The clatter of wheels on stone startled her from her thoughts. Her father looked up, frowning. At this hour, when the servant opened the door, the sight that met her eyes made her heart twist. Ernest Ashford stood on the threshold, the cold clinging to his dark coat, a faint trace of snow on his shoulders. He removed his hat slowly, his breath visible in the winter air. "Miss Harcourt," he said, and though his tone was courteous, his voice trembled at the edges. "Lord Ashford," she answered, her tone measured. "You honour us unexpectedly." "I feared the hour might be improper," he said, "but He hesitated, searching for words that could exist between duty and desire. "I wish to ensure you arrived home safely last night." Her father, sensing what was unspoken, excused himself with a quiet dignity. "I shall see to the horses." The door closed behind him, leaving the two of them alone in the soft glow of the fire. Ernest stepped closer, his gloves still in hand. "You left the assembly before you could what, my lord?" Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed the ache of restraint. "Before you could say soon again." He exhaled, his composure faltering. "You make it sound like cruelty." "Is it not?" she asked gently. "Cruelty does not always shout, Ernest. Sometimes it whispers and waits." Her use of his name startled him. He had heard it from her lips before, but never with such quiet defiance. "I have tried," he said. "You know I have tried." "Yes," she whispered. "You have tried to keep me safe, to guard my name, to make sure no one speaks ill of me. But, my lord, you have never tried to make me yours." He looked at her then, as though the air had left the room. "You think me a coward." She lowered her gaze, her lashes trembling. "I think you are torn between love and obedience, and I have no wish to be the rope." He took a step closer. The firelight drew faint amber glints in his grey-blue eyes. "My mother's influence is not easily defied," he said. "The estate—" She lifted a hand, silencing him. I know of your debts, your duty, your family's pride. I know it all. But you cannot build happiness on fear of ruin." Ernest's hands clenched at his sides. "And what would you have me do, Winifred? Throw away my title, abandon what generations before me have guarded?" "I would have you live," she said simply, "and not hide behind what is already crumbling." The silence that followed was a living thing. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind rattled the panes. He looked down at her, his voice rough. "Do you imagine I do not feel it? That I do not wake each day and curse the weight that keeps me from you?" Her throat tightened. "Then why must I pay for it, my lord? Why must I be the one to carry what you cannot name?" Ernest's control finally cracked, just slightly. His voice dropped low, intimate, trembling. "Because I have never known how to love you without destroying everything else." The admission struck her like a confession at an altar. She felt her pulse quicken, not from victory but from sorrow. "And I," she whispered, "have never known how to stop loving you, even as it destroys me." For a moment neither moved. The distance between them felt fragile enough to break with a breath. He reached for her hand then, slowly, reverently, and when his gloved fingers brushed hers, a shock of warmth ran through her arm. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it carried 6 years of longing compressed into a single heartbeat. "Forgive me," he said, withdrawing his hand as though it burned. "Forgive me for what I am too weak to change." Winifred turned toward the fire, her profile lit in gold. "Weakness is not in your heart, my lord. It is in your fear." He wanted to speak, to tell her that she was wrong, that he would find a way, that he could not bear the thought of her fading from his life like a ghost that haunted every quiet room. But the words died on his tongue, strangled by the same pride that had ruled him all his life. Instead, he said softly, "Will you allow me to call again tomorrow?" She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw both tenderness and fatigue. "You may call as often as you wish, my lord, but do not expect to find me waiting." Ernest flinched as if struck. Then he inclined his head with the elegance of a man trained never to reveal the wound. "Good evening, Miss Harcourt." When he left, the sound of the door closing behind him felt final. Winifred stood there for a long time, her hand resting on the mantel, the fire painting her face in light and shadow. That night, she dreamed of the first winter they had met, of a sleigh ride through fields of white, of laughter that had once been innocent, of the way he had looked at her as though she were the only thing worth saving. But dreams are fragile things. When she woke, the light was cold again, and the air in her room felt hollow. Days passed. Ernest's visits became fewer, each one more polite, more formal, as though they were rehearsing the art of farewell without speaking it aloud. The village noticed. The vicar's wife's visits became frequent under the guise of concern. The younger women whispered at the market. Winifred endured it all with grace, smiling when she must, working when she could, writing letters she never sent. Each day folded itself neatly into the next, until she realized she was no longer living, but waiting, and that waiting had become a habit as dangerous as love itself. One afternoon, she walked alone to the edge of the village, where the lane opened into rolling fields still brushed with frost. She stood there, the wind tugging gently at her shawl, and closed her eyes. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a world without him. It hurt, yes. But beneath the hurt was something else, a strange, clean freedom, like the first breath after a long illness. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her father, she spoke in a quiet voice that held more strength than sorrow. "Papa, if Mrs. Linton still needs a companion for her household, I think I should write to her." Mr. Harcourt looked at her for a long moment, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "You are certain?" She nodded. "I am certain." He reached for her hand, rough and warm. "Then you will go with my blessing." And though her smile trembled, it was real. Upstairs in her small room, Winifred stood before the window, gazing out at the faint silver of the moon over the hills. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of Ashford Manor gleamed faintly through the trees. For 6 years they had been her North Star, guiding her through doubt and hope alike. Now she turned from them, her reflection pale and resolute in the glass. She whispered into the quiet, her voice steady at last. "If he ever wishes to find me, he will have to learn how to run." And with that, Winifred Harcourt blew out the candle, leaving the room in darkness, her decision glowing brighter than any flame. The frost had melted into thin threads of mist that drifted through the fields, like ghosts reluctant to leave. Morning light spread across the Cotswolds in muted gold, resting gently on the stone cottages, the smoke curling upward from chimneys, the cobblestones still damp from night. Winifred Harcourt stood by her small writing desk near the parlour window, her pen unmoving above a sheet of ivory paper. The ink trembled at its tip, dark and heavy, waiting for courage that refused to come. The letter had begun as a thought only, something she told herself she would never write, because writing meant admitting what her heart had already decided. But silence had become unbearable. The house was too still, her days were too quiet. Even her father's steady kindness could not fill the hollow space where hope used to live. Her hand shook slightly as she began the first line. "My lord." She paused. The words felt foreign now. Once, his title had sounded like safety. Now, it was a wall. She drew a long breath and continued, "You have always been kind to me, perhaps too kind. That is the beginning of every tragedy, is it not? I do not wish to speak of regret, only of understanding. You are bound by duties I cannot share, and I have learned that love without courage is only endurance. For 6 years I have waited for something that cannot be spoken aloud. I will not wait any longer." She set the pen down, pressing her fingers against the paper as if to still its tremor. Outside, she could hear the distant call of a milk cart, the laughter of children on their way to the lane, the sound of life moving forward, everything she had forgotten how to join. The door opened softly behind her. Her father stepped in, carrying a small parcel of letters from the post. "Another grey morning," he said, laying them on the table. "And yet you look as though you are already walking towards spring." Winifred smiled faintly, her heart aching with affection for him. "Do I?" He nodded, taking a seat by the fire. "Your mother once looked like that the day she made a choice that frightened everyone but herself." Winifred turned toward him. "And was she happy?" "She was free," he said simply, "and that was happiness enough." His words settled in her chest like an answered prayer. When he left the room again, she returned to her writing. "Forgive me for leaving without proper farewell. I must go where I am not spoken of in whispers, where I can earn my days honestly, not by waiting for a mercy that will never come. I will pray for your peace, as I hope you might one day pray for mine." She signed it Winifred Harcourt, then folded the letter slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the paper as if memorizing its finality. She did not seal it yet. Instead, She stood and crossed the room to the mantel, where a small portrait of her mother rested. A gentle face, calm and resolute. "I have your strength," Winifred murmured, touching the frame lightly. "Now I must learn how to use it." The knock at the door startled her. It was not yet noon, and callers were rare at such an hour. When she opened it, the winter light spilled in behind a tall figure she knew too well, Ernest Ashford. He stood with his hat in hand, snow melting from his shoulders, eyes shadowed by something between exhaustion and longing. "Miss Harcourt," he said softly, "I beg your pardon for arriving without notice." Her pulse leapt before she could command it to behave. "You are forgiven, my lord, though you seem to make a habit of visiting without reason." He hesitated, stepping inside as she moved aside. The door closed behind them with a muted sound that felt like the world narrowing to two people. "I came to return this," he said, producing a small volume bound in dark leather. It was a book of poetry she had lent him the previous spring. "I found it in my study last evening and thought it unjust to keep something that belongs to you." Winifred accepted it, her fingers brushing his gloved ones for a fraction of a second. The contact was small, but it felt like standing too near to fire. "Poetry never seemed to suit you," she said lightly. "It did not," he admitted, his voice low, "until you did." The simplicity of the words stole her breath. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them carried the faint scent of winter roses and wood smoke. "I received word from London," he said at last. "My mother insists I attend the season. There are families to be met, alliances to consider. She believes it time I take my responsibilities more seriously." Winifred kept her expression composed. "She means for you to marry." His eyes met hers. "She does. And do you agree?" "I do not know what I agree to anymore," he confessed. "Each time I look at the path laid before me, I see a life without peace, and yet the thought of defying her—" He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. "You cannot know what that would mean." "I can imagine," she said quietly. "It would mean losing everything she built for you, your title, your inheritance, your comfort. And you think I value those things more than—" She interrupted gently. "I think you value them as you were taught to, and I cannot fault you for that. But I was not born to wait for the courage of others." The words lingered between them, fragile and absolute. He took a step closer, his voice breaking with sincerity. "Do not mistake my silence for indifference. There has not been a day—" "Please," she said softly, closing her eyes. "Do not say it." "But it is true," he insisted. "You are the one I think of when I rise, when I sleep, when I walk through the halls of that cursed house. Every thought that comforts me has your face upon it." Her eyes opened, shining but steady. "Then why am I still alone?" he faltered, and the answer fell away like ash. In that silence, something final took shape in her heart. She knew then that words would never save them. Words were what he used to delay the inevitable, to make her love sound noble instead of unfinished. "Lord Ashford," she said, stepping back, "you have always been kind, but I cannot live in kindness anymore. It has too many walls." His jaw tensed, his pride flaring just enough to cover pain. "You are angry." "No," she said, "I am tired." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not the gentle woman who waited, but the one who could walk away. "If you leave," he said, "I will not endure it." Her lips curved in something close to sorrowful affection. "Then you will have to learn how to endure what you created." For a moment he looked as if he might reach for her. His hand lifted an inch, then dropped again, as if the invisible chains of propriety pulled him back. "Winifred," he said, the name trembling on his tongue. She turned away, unwilling to let the sound undo her resolve. "Good day, my lord." He hesitated one heartbeat longer, then bowed, every movement measured, formal, tragic. "Good day." When he left, the scent of his presence lingered, cruel in its gentleness. Winifred stood very still, listening to the sound of his carriage wheels fade into the distance. Then, with deliberate care, she sealed the letter she had written that morning. That evening, she walked to the small church at the edge of the village. The air smelled of rain and cold stone. Inside, the candles flickered low, casting trembling shadows across the pews. She knelt near the altar, folding her hands as the silence of the place wrapped around her like an embrace. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me strength not to ask for what will never be given. Teach me to love without losing myself." Her voice faltered, but the stillness did not answer, only the faint creak of the church door as the wind moved through. She stayed there a long time, until her knees ached and her heart quieted. When she rose, she felt a strange peace, like the calm that follows a storm. Back at home, she placed the letter on her writing desk. The moonlight fell across it, silvering the edges of the paper. Tomorrow she would send it. Tomorrow she would begin the life that waited beyond the boundaries of this village, this love, this silence. Before going to bed, she opened the window to the cold night air. Somewhere beyond the fields, she thought she heard the distant sound of hooves, steady, measured, familiar. Her breath caught, but she did not move. If it was him, he would not come. If it was not, she no longer needed him to. Winifred closed the window gently, her fingers lingering on the latch as if saying goodbye to a world she had once believed would be hers. Then, with a calm that surprised even her, she whispered to the empty room, "Let him find peace where he did not find love." The candle beside her sputtered, then steadied, and she turned toward her bed. Tomorrow she would leave, but tonight, for the first time in 6 years, she slept without dreaming of his voice. The first light of dawn slipped gently across the stone walls of the Harcourt cottage, painting the room in soft shades of gold and grey. The world was still quiet, the village not yet awake, and a thin fog rested upon the hills as if the earth itself hesitated to begin another day. Winifred Harcourt stood by her small trunk, hands steady though her heart beat with the fragile rhythm of farewell. Her shawl, folded neatly beside the bed, carried the faint scent of lavender. She reached for it, wrapping it around her shoulders as one might wrap courage around fear. Outside, the frost sparkled like crushed glass, and in that frozen silence, she felt the certainty of her decision settle into her bones. On the small table near the window lay the sealed letter she had written to the Marquis of Ashford. The ink had dried in an even line, no tear stains upon the paper. Her handwriting was calm, graceful, unbetrayed by the tremor she had felt as she wrote it. The candle beside it had burned down to its final inch, leaving a small pool of hardened wax. Her father, awake earlier than usual, entered quietly. He wore his heavy wool coat, his hair still damp from the basin, and his kind eyes reflected both pride and sorrow. "You will not wait for the sun to rise?" he asked softly. "I must leave before the village does," she replied. "It is easier that way." He nodded, understanding without agreeing. "I have arranged for Mr. Linton's carriage to take you as far as the station. The driver knows the road well." Winifred stepped toward him and took his hand. "Thank you, Papa, for never asking me to stay." His fingers tightened around hers. "A father's love is not a chain, my dear. It is the prayer that follows you, no matter how far you go." Her throat constricted. "I will write to you every week." "I know you will." For a moment they simply stood there, the last quiet moment between them. Then with a trembling breath, Winifred picked up her gloves and bonnet. She looked once more around the small parlour, its familiar warmth filled with echoes of laughter, piano notes, and evenings spent pretending that the world was kind. She would miss the ticking of the mantel clock, the smell of wood smoke, even the faint creak of the floorboards that had carried her through childhood. When she stepped outside, the cold air struck her face like a baptism. The lane was still asleep, only the faint silhouettes of the hedgerows visible through the mist. The driver stood beside the carriage, his breath rising in small clouds as he loaded her trunk. "Ready, miss?" he asked. Winifred nodded, though the word caught in her throat. "Yes." As she placed one foot on the step, she hesitated, looking back at the cottage. Her father stood in the doorway, his figure framed by the soft glow of the fire behind him. He raised his hand in silent blessing. She lifted her gloved fingers in return. "Goodbye." The word was small, but it carried the weight of 6 years. The wheels began to turn, their rhythm slow at first, then steadier as the road opened before them. The sound of hooves echoed faintly through the still morning, each beat like the ticking of a clock that could no longer be stopped. Winifred kept her gaze forward, her eyes fixed on the faint light of the horizon. The road wound through the fields and pastures she had known all her life, the familiar shapes blurred behind the veil of mist. The old oak tree by the bend, the low stone wall that marked the Ashford property, the small chapel on the hill. Every turn seemed to whisper a memory, and she let them pass without holding on. Inside the carriage the silence grew thick. She opened her reticule, touching the folded letter inside. It was not to be sent. It had already been sent. But she carried its twin, a copy she had written for herself, a reminder that she had not left out of bitterness, but necessity. When the carriage reached the edge of the Ashford estate, she could not help but look out the window. Beyond the frost-covered fields rose the grey silhouette of the manor, grand and still against the pale morning. The windows glimmered faintly with the reflection of firelight within. She wondered if he was awake, if he knew. "Stop the carriage," she said suddenly. The driver turned, surprised. "Miss?" "Just for a moment." He pulled the reins, and the carriage slowed to a halt. Winifred opened the door and stepped out, her boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. The air smelled of smoke and earth, sharp and clean. She stood there, looking at the house that had held her dreams captive for so many years. From this distance, it looked like something out of a painting, beautiful, distant, untouchable. How many nights had she imagined walking up that long gravel path, not as a guest, but as his wife? How many times had she rehearsed the sound of his footsteps approaching the door, the soft click of the latch, the warmth of his voice saying her name not as obligation, but as belonging. The wind rose, carrying the faint toll of the church bell in the village below. It sounded like a farewell. Winifred closed her eyes, whispering to the morning, "Goodbye, Ernest." She turned and stepped back into the carriage. As it rolled forward again, she did not look back. At that same hour, within the manor's walls, Ernest Ashford stood by his study window, half-dressed, his cravat hanging loosely from his neck. The fire crackled behind him untouched. He had not slept. The letter lay on his desk, the seal broken, the words written in her delicate hand burning into his vision. He had read it once, then again, and again. Each sentence had cut him with precision. No accusation, no demand, only the final clarity of a woman who had loved too long in silence. "I will not wait any longer." He pressed his palm against the glass, his reflection pale in the dim light. The fog outside had thickened, hiding the road from view, but he could feel her absence like a storm building within him. The door opened behind him. His mother, the Dowager Marchioness, entered with her usual poise, dressed in deep violet silk, her expression unreadable. "You look unwell," she said. Ernest did not turn. "I received a letter. From Miss Harcourt, I presume." Her tone was smooth, indifferent. "It is for the best. I warned you that such attachments lead nowhere." He faced her then, his eyes cold. "You warned me that love is a weakness. I believed you once. I will not again." The dowager's lips curved in a faint disapproving smile. "Love does not sustain estates, my son, nor does it command respect." "Respect?" he repeated bitterly. "I have been respectable for 6 years, and in that respect I have lost the only thing that mattered." "You exaggerate." "I do not," he said sharply. "She has gone." For the first time, the dowager's composure faltered. "Gone?" He nodded, his voice tight. left the village, perhaps for good. There was a long silence. The dowager studied her son with something between curiosity and alarm. "Then you will recover. You are young enough to choose wisely this time." Ernest turned away, his jaw set. There will be no other choice. He left the room before she could answer. Outside, the horses were being saddled. The air was cold enough to bite, but he did not care. He mounted without hesitation, his coat unbuttoned, his gloves forgotten on the stable rail. "Where to, my lord?" asked the groom. Ernest looked toward the mist-covered fields. "The Harcourt cottage." He rode hard, the wind tearing at his hair, his breath sharp in his throat. The hooves struck the frozen ground like thunder, scattering the morning fog in his wake. The road narrowed through the hedgerows, and the chill sliced through his lungs. When he reached the cottage, the door was open, the hearth still burning low. Mr. Harcourt stood in the doorway, steady as the old oak behind the house. "You are too late, my lord," he said quietly. Ernest dismounted in a rush. "Where has she gone?" The older man looked at him, his expression not unkind. "To find her peace." "Tell me where." Mr. Harcourt shook his head. "If she wished you to follow, she would have left you a path." Ernest's breath caught, his pride collapsing beneath the weight of what he had done and what he had not. "She cannot mean to—" "She means to live," Mr. Harcourt interrupted gently. "That is all." Ernest turned toward the lane, his chest heaving. The tracks of the carriage wheels were still visible in the frost, curving away toward the main road. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen. Then he swung himself back onto his horse and spurred it forward. The villagers, still half asleep, watched from their doorways as the Marquis rode through, his face pale with desperation. The wind carried the sound of hooves echoing across the valley. He followed the road as far as he could, but the mist grew thicker, swallowing everything, until even the sound of his pursuit seemed to vanish into silence. Somewhere ahead, the carriage moved steadily on, unaware of the man chasing shadows behind it. Inside, Winifred sat with her gloved hands folded in her lap. The road curved away from the village, and with every turn, her heart grew lighter and heavier all at once. She felt the ache of loss like an old wound reopening, but beneath it was something new, something fierce and alive. Freedom. She did not know what awaited her, only that it would be hers to choose. As the carriage climbed the final hill, the rising sun broke through the mist, flooding the landscape with pale gold. The light touched her face, her eyes closing briefly as if in prayer. Behind her, far down the road, Ernest Ashford reined in his horse at the crest of another hill, breathless and defeated. The sun caught in his hair, the frost glittering around him like broken glass. He could no longer see her carriage, only the empty road stretched before him. He closed his eyes and whispered into the wind, "Winifred, forgive me." But the wind, like her silence, gave no answer, and so, with the first true morning of winter, she was gone. The frost had not yet melted when Ernest Ashford found himself galloping through the narrow lanes that cut across the Cotswolds countryside. The morning air was sharp enough to burn his lungs, and every breath came out ragged, steaming against the pale gold of the rising sun. His coat whipped violently behind him, the sound of hooves striking the frozen ground echoing like thunder in his chest. He could not feel his hands on the reins, only the wild urgency that drove him forward. He had no clear thought, no strategy, no sense of time. Only one truth repeated itself like a prayer and a curse. She is leaving. Winifred's name pressed against his heart with every beat, a rhythm of guilt and longing. The letter she had written haunted him with its devastating calm, words that did not accuse, but ended him all the same. He had never known silence to be so loud. The landscape blurred as he rode, stone walls, hedgerows glazed with ice, the faint silhouettes of cottages half hidden by mist. Somewhere ahead, on that endless road, was the carriage carrying her away from him. He imagined her sitting straight-backed and composed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon that did not include him. He urged his horse faster. By the time he reached the crossroads near the old mill, his breath came in gasps. The driver of a passing wagon shouted after him, startled by the sight of the Marquis in such disarray. Hair unkempt, cravat undone, his usual air of precision replaced by desperation. But Ernest heard nothing except the pounding of hooves and his own heartbeat, both too loud to ignore. Then in the distance he saw it, a carriage outlined against the pale winter light, the dark shape of the horses moving steadily along the road. His pulse surged. "Winifred!" he shouted. Though the word was swallowed by wind and distance, he spurred his horse forward, the ground trembling beneath him. The driver of the carriage, hearing the commotion, pulled on the reins. The horses slowed, snorting clouds of white breath into the air. The wheels creaked to a halt near the edge of the lane, where frost clung to every blade of grass. Inside, Winifred lifted her head. She knew that voice. Even muffled by distance and wind, it struck her like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Her breath caught. Her gloved hand froze halfway to her reticule. "Miss?" the driver asked, uncertain. Winifred's throat felt tight. "Continue," she said softly, but it was too late. Ernest had reached them. He rode up beside the carriage, dismounting before the horse had fully stopped. The suddenness of his movement startled the driver, who climbed down quickly, hat in hand, unsure whether to interfere or to vanish into the hedgerow. Ernest paid him no mind. He went straight to the door, his boots crunching on the frost, his gloved hand gripping the edge of the carriage as if it were the only solid thing in the world. "Winifred," he said, breathless, "please, open the door." Her pulse raced, but she remained still. Through the window she saw him, his face pale, hair disheveled, his eyes wild with something she had never seen in him before. For a heartbeat she hesitated, torn between pride and heartbreak. Then, with a steady breath, she reached for the latch and pushed the door open. He stood there, the wind tugging at his coat, his eyes meeting hers with all the force of 6 years of restraint finally breaking. "Why did you come?" she asked quietly. He stepped closer. "Because I could not let you go." Winifred's fingers tightened around the edge of the seat. "You let me go every day for 6 years, she said, her voice trembling though she fought to keep it calm. "I was a fool," he said hoarsely, "a coward. I told myself that silence was mercy, that waiting would protect you. But I was only protecting myself, from scandal, from my mother, from everything that would have made me fight for you." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "And now? Now I would fight the entire world," he said, stepping forward until his hand rested against the carriage door. "If it meant one more chance to stand beside you." She shook her head. "Do not say what you think I want to hear. Not out of guilt." "Guilt?" He almost laughed, the sound raw. "No, not guilt. Regret. 1,000 nights of it. Every time I closed my eyes and saw you waiting, I told myself I was doing right by you. That patience was love. But I see now, patience was my punishment, not yours." Winifred's breath caught, and for a moment she could not speak. The sunlight broke through the clouds then, falling across his face, and she saw the man she had loved for so long. Not the Marquis, not the figure of duty, but the man stripped of every defense. "I wrote to you," she said softly. "You received it." He nodded. "And it broke me. Then you understand why I must leave." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. "I understand why you wanted to, but if you go now, you will take what little remains of me." "Ernest," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you cannot say such things to make me stay." "Then tell me how to make it true," he said, his voice breaking. "Tell me how to undo 6 years of silence." Her lips parted, but no words came. The world seemed to pause. The only sounds were the wind, the soft stamping of the horses, and their breaths mingling in the cold air. At last, she spoke. "You cannot undo it. You can only prove that what you say now will not vanish when it becomes inconvenient." He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I will prove it. To you, to everyone." "By words?" she asked. By promises? No, he said firmly. By actions. By truth. She looked at him for a long moment, the fog of her breath between them like a fragile veil. And what truth will you tell? That I love you, he said simply. The words were quiet, but they seemed to echo across the hills. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The sunlight shifted, and the frost on the branches glittered like crystal, as if even nature held its breath. Winifred closed her eyes, a single tear slipping free despite her will. You should have said that before the world taught me how to stop waiting for it. He stepped closer, his hand finally finding hers. The touch was hesitant, reverent. Then let me say it now, when it costs me everything. Her gaze lifted to his. And what of your mother, of your title? Let them fall where they must, he said, his voice steady now, conviction sharpening it into something fierce. I would rather lose all I possess than lose the only thing that makes it worth possessing. She drew a shaky breath, the ache in her chest both unbearable and sweet. Do not tempt me with what you may not have the strength to keep. I have strength enough, he said, if you will let me prove it. The driver shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen but unable to look away. The horses stamped their hooves impatiently, as if urging an ending. Winifred withdrew her hand gently, folding it in her lap. You think love can be rescued by confession, she said softly, but I have learned it must also be earned by change. Then I will change, he said quickly. Tell me how. Her eyes met his with quiet sorrow. By not asking me to stay, not until you have stood before your mother, your world, and spoken this love aloud. He blinked, the color draining from his face. You would have me. Yes, she interrupted gently. If you wish to prove that what we share is not shameful, then show them. Speak my name where they can hear it. For a long moment, the wind carried only silence. Then, slowly, Ernest nodded. I will. Winifred held his gaze, searching for truth there, and for the first time she saw it not as longing but resolve. She drew a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. Then go, she said softly. Do what you must, but do not follow me until you have done it. His voice broke, and if I return too late. Her lips curved in a sad smile. Then at least I will know you truly loved me. Ernest's hand lingered on the carriage door, his fingers brushing the edge of her glove one last time. It was a touch without promise, without possession, only the memory of all they had been and all they might still be. Winifred, he whispered, I will not fail you again. She nodded, unable to speak. Then she turned her face away, signaling the driver. The horses began to move, the wheels crunching softly over the frost. Ernest stepped back, watching as the carriage rolled away, his heart aching with every turn of the wheels. When the sound finally faded, he stood alone on the road, the cold biting through his clothes, the sky brightening into pale blue. He pressed a trembling hand to his chest, where her name echoed still. And for the first time in his life, the Marquis, who had always chosen silence, found himself praying, not for redemption, but for courage. Far ahead, inside the carriage, Winifred kept her eyes on the road before her. She did not look back, though every instinct begged her to. Instead, she whispered a single truth into the still air. He will have to become the man he was meant to be, she said, and I must become the woman who no longer waits. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the hills. Behind them lay 6 years of silence. Before them stretched the uncertain promise of change. And though they were apart, their hearts, for the first time, beat toward the same direction. The winter sun had already begun to fade when Ernest Ashford reached the top of the long gravel drive leading to Ashford Manor. The great house loomed ahead, its grey stone facade cold and severe, the windows glinting faintly like mirrors, too proud to reflect warmth. The wind swept through the high oaks surrounding the estate, carrying with it the distant scent of smoke and frost. The air itself seemed to whisper of judgment. He dismounted slowly, his body trembling from exhaustion. The stable hands rushed forward to take his horse, but he barely heard them. His thoughts were still on the road, on the sound of carriage wheels fading into the distance, on the look in Winifred's eyes when she told him to go. Her calm strength that had undone him more than any tears could have. Inside, the manor was dimly lit. A footman took his coat, glancing nervously at the Marquis's dishevelled appearance. Ernest's boots left small patches of melted frost upon the polished floor. A quiet rebellion against the perfection his mother demanded of everything within these walls. "Her ladyship awaits you in the drawing-room," the servant murmured. "Of course she does," Ernest replied under his breath, his voice hoarse. He walked through the long corridor lined with portraits of his ancestors. Solemn men and stern women painted in dark oils, all of them staring down as if to remind him that duty was not a choice, but a birthright. Each gaze seemed to echo the same accusation: "You have risked everything for love." When he entered the drawing-room, the scent of rose oil and coal greeted him. The Dowager Marchioness sat near the hearth, dressed in deep violet silk, her posture impeccable, her expression composed in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime disguising displeasure behind dignity. Her lace cap framed her sharp features, and her gloved hands rested lightly on the armrest of her chair. "Ernest," she said, her tone neither welcoming nor cold, merely controlled, "you look unsettled." He stopped in the center of the room, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. "I have been riding since dawn." "So I see," she replied, her eyes flicking to the mud on his boots before returning to his face. "I assume this has something to do with Miss Harcourt's disappearance." He stiffened. "You know then?" The Dowager gave a small, satisfied smile. "The village speaks quickly, my dear. You cannot imagine how swiftly news travels when something scandalous occurs." "Scandalous?" he repeated, incredulous. "A woman choosing to live her life is not a scandal." "It is when that woman has been the subject of 6 years of speculation concerning the intentions of the Marquis of Ashford," his mother replied calmly. "You have turned kindness into humiliation, for her and for yourself." Ernest felt the anger rise within him, sharp and unrestrained. "You call it humiliation because you believe affection is beneath our name." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Affection is a luxury, Ernest. Duty is survival. You may choose the former when you can afford to lose the latter." He took a step forward. "I have already lost her. What more is there to lose?" The Dowager's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Your inheritance, perhaps. Your standing among those who hold your debts. The reputation of a house that has endured centuries of scrutiny. Shall I continue?" Her words landed like stones in his chest. He looked away, toward the window, where the bare branches of the oak scratched against the glass. "You speak as though our fortune were unshakable." "It is not unshakable," she said, her voice lowering. "But it is fragile enough that your romantic folly could break it. Do not think I am unaware of what the creditors whisper. Your father's generosity was admirable, but foolish. The estate is not what it once was. We depend on alliances now, alliances built through marriage." Ernest turned back to her, his face pale. "You mean you depend on them?" "I mean we all do," she answered firmly. "A marquis's ruin is not personal. It is hereditary. It stains the family for generations." He drew in a sharp breath. "And so you would have me barter myself for solvency?" "I would have you act as your father would have wished," she said, "with reason, not with sentiment. There is a young woman in London whose dowry would restore our position entirely. Her father is prepared to finalize arrangements by spring. I have already begun correspondence." The words struck him like a physical blow. "Without my consent, with your best interest," she said simply. Ernest moved closer to the fire, his shadow falling long across the ornate carpet. He stared into the flames, his voice low and dangerous. "And what of my heart, mother? Does that require your correspondence as well?" The Dowager's patience thinned. "Your heart is a muscle, Ernest, not a guide. It will not pay the servants, it will not keep the tenants housed through winter, and it certainly will not repair the debts your father left behind." He turned sharply toward her. "Then perhaps you should have married for money instead of teaching me to do it." The silence that followed was tense, brittle. For a moment she looked at him, not as her son, but as an adversary. "You forget yourself," she said quietly. He met her gaze without flinching. "No, I have only just remembered who I am." She rose from her chair with regal precision. "If you intend to disgrace this family further, do so outside these walls. I will not have you drag the name of Ashford into the mud with your infatuation." "Infatuation?" The word burst from him with a bitter laugh. "You think this is whimsy? I have loved her more faithfully than I have lived. She is the one honest thing in my entire existence." "Then you are a fool," she said, her voice icy. "Perhaps," he replied, "but at least I'm a fool who finally feels alive." The dowager's eyes hardened. "You will regret speaking to me this way. When you find yourself without fortune, without home, you will understand what survival costs." Ernest's expression softened then, though the sorrow behind it was unbearable. "And when you find yourself alone in this great house, surrounded by portraits of people who lived without love, you will understand what I have lost." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "If you walk out that door, do not expect to return the same way." He looked over his shoulder, meeting her gaze one last time. "I do not intend to return the same man." When the door closed behind him, the dowager remained perfectly still. Only her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly beneath their gloves. Ernest walked through the hall with the heavy certainty of someone who had burned his last bridge. His reflection followed him in the darkened glass, haunted, resolute. He entered his father's old study, where the smell of tobacco and leather still lingered. The great desk was covered in correspondence, ledgers, and unopened letters stamped with the crests of impatient creditors. He sank into the chair and began to read. The figures blurred before his eyes, debts far deeper than his mother had admitted, the weight of generations pressing on his shoulders. Every choice his father had made out of generosity had become his inheritance of guilt. When the clock struck 4, the butler entered quietly. "My lord," he said, "there is a visitor." Ernest looked up, weary. "At this hour?" "She insisted," the butler said. "Miss Eliza Harrow, Lady Bensham's niece." Ernest frowned. "Send her in." The young woman who entered was dressed impeccably in pale lavender, her golden curls arranged with deliberate perfection. She curtsied with practiced grace. "Lord Ashford, forgive my intrusion." He rose politely. "Miss Harrow, you are far from London." She smiled faintly. "My aunt suggested I come to the country for a few weeks. She thought the air might clarify matters." He understood at once. This was his mother's doing. "You mean she sent you?" he said. Eliza's smile faltered slightly. "She hopes to see you content, my lord." "As do I." Ernest studied her. She was kind, gentle even, but her words felt rehearsed, the warmth in her eyes polite rather than real. He realized then that this was what his life would become. Dinners with conversation measured to propriety, affection replaced by alliance, a life perfectly acceptable and completely empty. "Miss Harrow," he said quietly, "I appreciate your effort, but I must be honest, you deserve more than a man whose heart is elsewhere." Her expression softened. "And she is worth such defiance?" He hesitated, the question cutting deep. "She is worth my life." Eliza gave a small, rueful smile. "Then I almost envy her." She curtsied again. "Good evening, my lord." When she was gone, Ernest sank back into the chair. The firelight flickered across his face, and he pressed his hands to his eyes. Everything, his family, his title, his comfort, seemed to crumble beneath the weight of a single truth. He loved Winifred Harcourt, and nothing else mattered. Outside, the wind howled across the manor grounds, rattling the old shutters like a warning. The dowager sat alone in her chamber upstairs, her sewing untouched on her lap, her face pale in the candlelight. She told herself she had done what was right, that her son would come to his senses. But beneath her calm exterior, a shadow of fear crept in, a fear that for the first time he truly would not. And in the cold heart of the great house, the Marquis began to plan, not for survival, not for duty, but for redemption, for the woman who had left, and for the man he had vowed to become. The Cotswolds had begun to thaw under the first promise of spring, though the air still carried the brittle chill of winter. The snow had receded into shallow patches along the stone walls, and the fields were waking slowly, green struggling through grey. Yet inside Ashford Manor, warmth had not returned. The Dowager Marchioness had declared her son's behaviour reckless, his intentions ruinous, and his silence unforgivable. By the end of the week, every household from the vicarage to the farthest tenant farm whispered that Lord Ashford had lost his senses. Some said over a woman who had dared to leave him. Whispers spread quickly through the small world that had always claimed to protect Winifred Harcourt. Now it turned on her. In the market square, among baskets of wool and early blooms, women gathered in polite clusters that hid sharp tongues. "She has written to him again," one insisted. "No woman leaves a man like that unless she means to make him chase her. Or perhaps she went away to force his hand," another said. "There's cunning beneath all that composure." "And to think she attended church every Sunday," murmured a third, with the smugness of the morally secure. Winifred had not returned to the village since her departure. She was living quietly in the neighbouring county, serving as companion to Mrs. Linton, a widow of kind heart and quick wit. Mrs. Linton's home sat at the edge of a small river, where willows trailed their branches like curtains of silver. The house was modest compared to the Ashfords' manor, but there was peace in its simple order, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, the scent of beeswax and lavender, the creak of the stair each morning when Winifred descended to the breakfast room. It was a quieter life, and she had begun to think perhaps that was enough, until the day Ernest appeared again, uninvited, unannounced, and undeniably changed. She found him standing at the gate as she returned from the village, his dark coat brushed clean, his hat in hand. His presence was as shocking as it was familiar, his eyes searching her face with a mixture of hope and apology. "Miss Harcourt," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. "May I have a moment?" Her pulse faltered. "You should not have come here, my lord. There are people who would delight in seeing you do so." "Let them watch," he replied. "For once I have nothing to hide." She hesitated. The carriage road behind him was empty, the sky low and pale. The wind tugged at the ribbons of her bonnet, carrying away her reply before she could form it. "Please," he said, stepping closer, "if I leave without speaking to you, I will never forgive myself." Winifred studied him, her breath unsteady. His face bore the marks of sleeplessness, the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. But there was something else too, something new, determination. "Very well," she said finally, motioning toward the narrow path leading to the riverside. "A few minutes." They walked in silence at first, the gravel crunching beneath their steps, the water murmuring beside them. When they reached the old oak by the bend, she stopped, turning to face him. "Why are you here, Ernest?" He took a deep breath, as if steadying himself before battle. "Because I kept my word. I spoke your name where all could hear it." Her heart stopped. "You? What do you mean?" He met her gaze without flinching. "My mother summoned her friends last week, the same circle that has ruled this county's opinion for 2 decades. I stood before them all and told them the truth, that you are the woman I love, that I will not marry for title or convenience, nor will I be shamed for wanting a future built on honesty instead of alliance." Winifred stared at him, words failing her. The enormity of it sank in slowly, like light breaking through fog. "You said that before them? And before the entire parish," he said, "at the Sunday service." She gasped. "Ernest, are you mad?" "Completely," he said, smiling faintly. But it is the first kind of madness that has ever felt right. Her hand lifted to her throat, trembling. Your mother must be furious, he finished. She has declared that I am no longer her son until I renounce you. The creditors are circling, the servants gossip, the estate lawyer has begun to remind me of what I stand to lose. He paused, then added softly, but I have never felt so free. Winifred turned away, the river's reflection trembling at her feet. And you think this absolves you? She asked, her voice shaking. You think grand gestures can undo years of silence? He stepped closer, his voice raw. No, I know nothing can undo them, but I had to begin somewhere. I could not let the story end with me letting you walk away while I hid behind duty. She looked at him then, really looked. The man before her was not the careful Marquis she had known, nor the fearful son shackled by his mother's will. His eyes burned with conviction. There was vulnerability in them, yes, but also truth. Her resolve began to waver, but before she could speak, the sound of hurried footsteps broke the stillness. Mrs. Linton appeared at the top of the path, her face pale with agitation. Winifred, you must come inside at once. What is it? Winifred asked, alarmed. Mrs. Linton hesitated, glancing uneasily at Ernest. It is your name, my dear. It has reached the papers. The papers? Ernest repeated sharply. Mrs. Linton nodded, lowering her voice. The London Gazette. It speaks of an improper attachment between the Marquis of Ashford and a woman of lesser station who fled his household. Winifred's face went white. That is a lie. I know it, Mrs. Linton said, clutching her arm, but lies have wings. Ernest's expression darkened. My mother, he said under his breath. Winifred turned to him, her voice trembling with anger and despair. You told the truth, and she answered it with poison. He took her hands, heedless of who might see. Then we will face it together. She pulled back. Together? Ernest, this could destroy you. Let it, he said fiercely. If the price of love is reputation, I pay it gladly. Her breath hitched. You do not know what you are saying. I know exactly what I am saying, he replied. For 6 years I was silent, and it nearly killed me. I will not be silent again. Not when they twist your name to shield their own pride. Tears blurred her vision. You cannot fight your mother's influence. The truth will drown in her wealth. Then I will make the world hear it from my own mouth, he said. I will not allow them to turn you into a scandal when you have been nothing but grace. She shook her head, her composure breaking. And what if they mock you? What if they ruin everything? He smiled, faint but sure. Then let them. I will have chosen something worth ruin. Mrs. Linton, standing a few paces away, cleared her throat delicately. If I may speak plainly, my lord, your devotion is admirable, but my household cannot be the stage for this war. Ernest bowed slightly. You are right, madam. Forgive the intrusion. I only ask that you protect her until I set this right. Winifred's lips parted. And how will you do that? He looked at her with quiet intensity, by showing them that honor still exists in love. When he left, the air seemed to shift, the world smaller, quieter, fragile. Winifred stood by the riverbank long after he had gone, her heart torn between disbelief and fear. Mrs. Linton touched her shoulder gently. He means it, my dear, she said softly. Whatever else the world may say, you have changed him. Winifred closed her eyes. Then heaven help him, because the world will not. That evening, the scandal spread faster than the river's current. The gossip reached drawing rooms in Bath and parlours in London. The Dowager Marchioness made her move, hosting a grand tea for every family of consequence in the county. The invitations were worded carefully, to restore dignity to a house misrepresented by rumour. By the time Ernest arrived, summoned by propriety and defiance alike, the drawing room was full. Teacups clinked. Murmurs hushed as he entered. His mother rose from her seat, regal and cold. My son, she said in a voice meant for everyone to hear, perhaps now you will tell us what has so possessed your reason that you endanger everything your father built. Ernest's gaze swept the room, then settled on her. "It is not possession, mother. It is love." A gasp rippled through the guests. He continued, his voice calm but strong. "And if that word offends anyone here, then you have forgotten what it means to be human." The dowager's fan snapped shut. "You disgrace yourself." "I reclaim myself," he said, "and the name you think I have shamed will be remembered for its truth, not its fear." Ooh. Then, before anyone could speak, he turned to the room and said clearly, "Miss Winifred Harcourt is a woman of integrity, and if I am judged for valuing her, then so be it. I will not repent for loving her." The room erupted in whispers, but he did not wait for their verdict. He left without another word, the echo of his footsteps ringing like a challenge through the grand hall. Outside, the wind had turned sharp again, scattering the first petals of spring blossoms across the drive. He stood beneath the darkening sky, breathing hard, his heart raw and alive. For the first time in his life, Ernest Ashford had spoken without permission, and he had spoken her name as though it were a prayer. And though miles away Winifred did not yet know it, the world that sought to bury her had begun to tremble. The sky that morning was the color of pewter, heavy and low, as if the heavens themselves carried a secret they could no longer hold. The scent of rain hung thick over the valley, mingling with the damp sweetness of early blossoms and the distant smoke of hearth fires. In Mrs. Linton's garden, the air trembled with the promise of a storm. Winifred Harcourt stood beneath the porch, watching the clouds gather above the river bend. Her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, her thoughts as restless as the wind. The newspaper lay folded on the small table beside her, its headlines still seared into her mind. The Marquis who defied society for love. She had not asked for such defiance. She had not wanted her name carried into the parlours of people who would never understand her heart. Yet every line she read spoke of Ernest's declaration, his public confession, his refusal to recant, his mother's outrage. The ink seemed to pulse with the consequences of his choice. Mrs. Linton had tried to console her. "My dear, few men of his rank have ever spoken with such courage. You should be proud." Pride, Winifred thought, was a luxury she could not afford. She had lived long enough under the shadow of others' opinions to know that public courage often came at a private cost. She turned away from the garden and entered the house, where the scent of tea and lemon balm still lingered from breakfast. The rooms were quiet, too quiet. Every clock seemed to tick more loudly, every creak of the floorboards, a whisper of doubt. She sat at her writing desk, the same desk where she had written her farewell months ago. This time she did not take up the pen. Her heart was too full for words. Outside, the first drops began to fall. Slow, deliberate, they darkened the path that led from the gate to the river. Then, through the mist and the rain, came the faint rhythm of hooves. At first, she thought it a trick of the storm. But the sound grew louder. Steady, purposeful, unmistakable. She froze, her heart leaping against her ribs. "Winifred!" Mrs. Linton called from the parlour, her tone both startled and amused. "You might wish to compose yourself. The Marquis has ridden straight into the rain." Winifred's breath caught. "Here?" "Here," Mrs. Linton confirmed, peering through the window with a smile that was half concern, half delight. And in rather dramatic fashion, if I may say so. Winifred moved to the door before she could think better of it. When she stepped outside, the world was shrouded in rain. The sky had opened fully now, and the steady downpour blurred everything into shades of silver and grey. And there, through the curtain of water, he appeared, on horseback, soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his coat clinging to his frame. He dismounted before the gate, his boots sinking into the wet earth. His eyes found hers immediately, piercing through the storm as if nothing else existed. "Ernest," she whispered, the sound lost in the rain. He strode toward her, each step heavy with purpose. When he reached the porch, he paused only long enough to remove his hat, water cascading from its brim. "You should not be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," he replied, his chest rising and falling, "but I could not stay away." She met his gaze, and in it she saw exhaustion, determination, and something deeper, an ache that mirrored her own. "You've caused quite the storm," she said softly, trying to summon a smile. He gave a quiet laugh, rough and unsteady. "Not half as fierce as the one you've caused within me." She looked away, her throat tightening. "The world is talking, Ernest. They will destroy your name for this." "Then let them speak," he said, stepping closer. "Let them write what they will. My name means nothing if it cannot be spoken beside yours." The words hit her like lightning, beautiful, reckless, impossible. "You do not understand," she whispered. "Your world thrives on destruction. Once they begin, they will not stop." "Then I will stop them," he said simply. She shook her head. "And how will you fight what cannot be touched? You cannot silence 1,000 whispers." "No," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "But I can speak louder." The rain fell harder, running down his face like tears. He took another step forward, his boots now inches from the hem of her gown. The scent of rain-soaked wool and damp earth surrounded them. "Winifred," he said softly, "I have spent my life obeying silence. Every time I looked at you, every moment I wanted to reach for you, I told myself that duty was stronger than desire. But when I stood before them and spoke your name, I realized something. Duty cannot survive where truth has already bloomed." Her eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hold them back. "And what if truth ruins us both?" He lifted his hand, hesitated, then brushed a single wet curl from her cheek. The touch was tentative, reverent. "Then let it ruin us, beautifully." Her breath caught. The warmth of his fingers against her cold skin made her heart ache. "You speak as though love was simple." "It is not simple," he said quietly. "It is salvation." For a long moment neither moved. The world seemed to still, the rain softening to a whisper around them. Finally, she found her voice. "You should not have come." "I could not stay away," he repeated. "Your mother will never forgive this." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "Then she will have to learn forgiveness, as I have learned love, slowly, painfully, and without permission." The porch creaked under their weight as he stepped closer. The space between them disappeared, yet they did not touch. Their eyes locked, and in that silent exchange lay every word they had not dared to speak. "I do not know how to begin again," she whispered. "Then let me begin for both of us," he said. "I will make the world see you as I do. They may never accept us, but they will know the truth." "And what is the truth, Ernest?" He looked at her as if memorizing every detail, the way her lashes clung together from the rain, the tremor in her lower lip, the defiance still burning in her gaze. "That I love you," he said, "and I will not apologize for it." She turned her face away, her tears indistinguishable from the rain. "You should not say such things in storms. They sound like promises." He smiled sadly, then let them be. A clap of thunder rolled across the hills, deep and distant. Winifred flinched, and he instinctively reached for her hand. Their fingers met, cold and trembling, but neither pulled away. The contact was fragile, desperate, electric. "Come inside," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll catch your death." He shook his head. "Not yet. Not before I tell you what I came to say." "Then say it," she murmured. He took a breath, the rain still running down his face. "When I spoke your name in front of them, they laughed. But then they stopped. Do you know why? Because they saw that I was not ashamed. They saw that love could belong to anyone brave enough to claim it. And I would claim it again, even if it meant losing everything else." Her tears fell freely now, mingling with the rain. "You cannot lose everything for me." "I already have," he said softly, "and it is the first loss that has ever felt like freedom." The silence that followed was unbearable. Winifred closed her eyes, her hand still in his. She wanted to tell him that he was a fool, that this love would cost them dearly, but her heart refused to speak lies. When she opened her eyes again, he was still there, watching her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. "You should go," she said weakly. He nodded. "I will, but not before you tell me to." She hesitated, her lips parting, but no sound came. The truth sat on her tongue, heavy and fragile. "If I tell you to go," she said finally, "will you truly obey?" He met her gaze with infinite tenderness. "Only if you tell me without trembling." Her breath caught, her resolve faltered, and for a single heartbeat, she forgot the world beyond that rain-soaked porch. Her heart betrayed her silence. "Ernest," she whispered, her voice breaking, "why must you make it so hard to let you go?" "Because I was a coward once," he said softly, "and I have spent every day since trying to be brave enough for the both of us." The thunder rolled again, closer now, and he stepped back slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will not force you," he said, "but I will not stop loving you." She wanted to answer, to reach for him, to beg him to stay. But before she could, he turned and walked down the path, the rain swallowing his figure until he was only a shadow moving through silver light. Winifred remained at the threshold, her heart pounding, the scent of rain and memory clinging to her skin. When she finally stepped back inside, the warmth of the room felt unbearable. Mrs. Linton appeared in the doorway, her expression soft with understanding. "He came for you," she said gently. Winifred nodded, her voice barely audible. "And now he's gone again." Mrs. Linton looked toward the window where the rain still fell like unending tears. "Perhaps not forever, my dear. Men who speak that kind of truth rarely leave it unfinished." Winifred said nothing. She simply stood there, her hands clasped over her heart, the sound of the rain echoing the rhythm of her thoughts. Outside, the storm began to ease, and the last of the light returned to the valley. The world looked washed clean, brighter, sharper, waiting. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the veil of rain, Ernest Ashford rode on, the taste of her name still on his lips, the storm behind him, and a vow burning in his heart. The first snow of December fell over Gloucestershire with quiet persistence, blanketing the hills and softening the cruel edges of gossip. Inside Ashford Manor, however, the air was not softened at all. The Dowager Marchioness had decided with imperious certainty to host her annual winter gala, despite the scandal that had recently tarnished her son's name. She called it an act of propriety, though everyone knew it was an act of vengeance. For days, servants polished silver and arranged flowers imported from London, their hands trembling under her sharp gaze. Invitations had been sent to every influential family within 50 miles, carefully worded, to promise elegance and to imply reconciliation. The county's elite were eager to attend. They wanted to see if the fallen Marquis would appear. Ernest Ashford had not left the manor in weeks. Since his encounter with Winifred in the rain, he had been both restless and withdrawn, walking the corridors like a man haunted by something just beyond reach. The scandal had not faded as he hoped. It had deepened, twisted by idle tongues into a tale of impropriety and ruin. His mother's fury was now ice, silent, precise, and unbearable. On the morning of the gala, he stood in his father's study, staring at the portrait above the mantel, a man painted in prime and pride, wearing the same family ring Ernest now wore. His reflection in the glass looked tired, stripped of illusions. The butler entered quietly. "Her ladyship requests your attendance this evening, my lord. She insists it would calm speculation." Ernest turned, his expression unreadable. "Calm speculation or feed it?" The butler hesitated. "Perhaps both." He almost smiled. "Then I suppose I shall give them what they came for." When evening fell, the manor transformed into a world of candlelight and music. The grand chandeliers blazed, their crystal arms dripping gold. The scent of roses and mulled wine filled the air. Ladies in silk gowns and jeweled gloves whispered behind their fans. Gentlemen discussed politics in tones of false indifference. Beneath the refinement, curiosity pulsed like a secret heartbeat. The guests waited for the Marquis, and then he appeared. Ernest descended the staircase slowly, dressed in black and silver, his expression calm but distant. The murmur of conversation faltered. He looked like a man carved from resolve, beautiful and tragic all at once. His mother, radiant in dark violet, greeted him with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Thank you for honoring the family this evening," she said, her voice smooth as crystal. "I came to honor the truth," he replied quietly. Her smile stiffened. "You will dance, you will charm, and you will remind them of who you are." He inclined his head. "That depends, mother. Do you still know who I am?" Her fan snapped shut in irritation, but before she could answer, another voice cut through the music. "Lord Ashford," called Sir Reginald Harcourt, a distant relative of Winifred's late father. His tone was cordial but faintly mocking. "It's good to see you among us again. The county has missed its favourite topic of conversation." Ernest met his gaze with perfect composure. "Then I am pleased to offer entertainment without charge." Laughter rippled through the room, some polite, some cruel. Ernest ignored it, his eyes scanning the crowd. He did not expect to find her here. He would not have wished her near such a spectacle. Yet every candle, every soft note of the waltz reminded him of her presence, of what she had taken with her when she left. Meanwhile, far from the manor, Winifred Harcourt sat in the quiet parlour of Mrs. Linton's home, embroidery forgotten on her lap. The letter lay open before her, a formal invitation to the Ashford Winter Gala, written not by Ernest but by his mother's hand. Mrs. Linton had frowned when it arrived. "It's a trap, my dear. She means to parade you before them, to see if you will flinch." Winifred had agreed, and yet she had kept the letter. Now, as the clock struck 8, she rose from her chair and walked to the window. Snow was falling in soft flakes, the world outside silver and still. She knew she should stay away. She knew what awaited her there, judgment, whispers, pity disguised as politeness. But she also knew that Ernest had stood for her when no one else dared. And so, with quiet determination, she made her choice. 2 hours later, the great doors of Ashford Manor opened again. The musicians paused. A hush fell across the ballroom as a young woman stepped inside, her cloak glistening with snow, her eyes luminous beneath the candlelight. Winifred Harcourt. The dowager's expression froze. Ernest's breath caught. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and yet could not believe it now that it was real. Every gaze turned toward her. The lady's whispers began at once. "She has nerve. She must be desperate. Look how calm she is." But Winifred heard none of it. Her steps were slow, deliberate, her chin lifted with quiet dignity. She stopped at the edge of the marble floor, where Ernest waited as if fate had planted him there. Their eyes met. The music resumed, faint at first, a slow, melancholy waltz that seemed to echo every heartbeat in the room. Ernest crossed the floor toward her, the sea of onlookers parting like water. When he reached her, he bowed, his voice low but steady. "Miss Harcourt." "My lord," she replied, her tone calm, though her heart raced. "May I have the honor?" The dowager's fan clattered to the floor. The crowd collectively held its breath, and Winifred, after the briefest hesitation, placed her gloved hand in his. The waltz began. For a moment, the world disappeared. The room faded into candlelight and shadow, the whispers into music. His hand found the small of her back. Hers rested lightly in his. The rhythm drew them close, closer than they had been allowed to be for 6 long years. "You should not have come," he whispered. "And yet here I am," she said softly. "You spoke my name before the world. It was only fair that I come to see what you had done with it." His lips curved faintly. "I would give it to you entirely, if you asked." Her gaze lifted to his. "And would you take mine in return?" "I already have," he said. The music swelled, and they turned through the crowd, their movements perfectly in time, though their hearts beat chaotically. Around them, society watched with wide eyes, half in admiration, half in horror. The Marquis and the woman who had undone him danced as if no scandal could touch them. When the final note faded, silence hung heavy. Winifred withdrew her hand, her composure unshaken. "Thank you, my lord," she said, "for the dance, and for the courage you found when I no longer had mine." Ernest bowed slightly. "You gave it back to me tonight." The dowager rose abruptly, her face pale with fury. "Enough!" Every head turned. The orchestra fell silent. "This farce ends now," she declared. "My son will not drag this house further into disgrace. Miss Harcourt, you will leave at once." Winifred met her gaze calmly. "If you wish it, my lady, I will. But I think you misunderstand. I did not come here to beg your acceptance. I came to thank your son." "Thank him?" The dowager's voice trembled with rage. "Yes," Winifred said quietly, "for teaching me that dignity is not bestowed by title or wealth, but by the truth one dares to live." The dowager's hand clenched around her fan. "You are insolent." "I am free," Winifred said simply. Ernest stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Mother, that is enough. You will not speak to her that way, not here, not ever. You would defend her against me." "I would defend what is right," he said firmly. For a long moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, the dowager turned away, her shoulders rigid. "Do as you will, Ernest, but do not come to me when the world turns its back on you." He bowed his head slightly. "The world may turn its back, but I will no longer turn mine." Winifred's breath caught. The guests began to murmur again, their curiosity giving way to admiration. Some whispered that perhaps there was honor left in the old names after all. Ernest turned to her, his eyes soft. "I thought I had lost you forever," he said quietly. "You did," she whispered, "and yet somehow we are here." He smiled faintly. "Will you allow me to begin again?" She hesitated. The ballroom seemed to fade around them, the flicker of candles, the murmur of voices, the weight of so many watching eyes. In that instant, there was only him, his hand extended, the storm in his gaze replaced by something still and certain. "Perhaps," she said softly, "it is not beginning again, but beginning at last." Ernest's voice trembled. "Then stay, if only for tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, then placed her hand in his once more. "For tonight," she said. The orchestra resumed, this time with a softer melody, tender and slow. As they began to dance again, the murmurs faded into applause, uncertain at first, then growing, rippling through the room like the first thaw of spring. The dowager sat in silence, her fan trembling in her hand. She did not look at them, but she did not rise again. Ernest drew Winifred closer, their steps measured, graceful, and full of the quiet promise neither dared to speak aloud. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the world in white, as if even the heavens wished to start anew. The snow that had fallen on the night of the gala still rested on the hedgerows and stone walls like a quiet oath. Morning arrived pale and clean, turning Ashford Manor's grounds into a world of white and soft shadow. The servants moved as if the air itself had become delicate. Even the footfalls in the corridor seemed careful, as though the house were holding its breath after what had happened in the ballroom. Winifred Harcourt stood in a small guest chamber that Mrs. Linton had insisted she use. Her cloak hung to dry near the fire. Her gloves laid neatly on a chair. She had not slept. She had sat by the window, watching snow drift from branches, remembering the weight of Ernest's hand at the small of her back, the shock of applause rising in a room that had always withheld its approval. A knock came. Mrs. Linton entered first, wrapped in her travelling shawl, her expression alert and protective. Behind her, Ernest Ashford appeared at the threshold. He did not cross the room immediately. He stood still, as if he needed permission to exist beside her in the quiet. "May I speak with you?" he asked, his voice low. Winifred's heart tightened at the simplicity of it. "Yes." Mrs. Linton's gaze moved from one to the other. "I shall take my tea downstairs," she said, and with a meaningful look, half warning, half blessing, she left them alone. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like the end of an era. Ernest stepped forward. The morning light from the window outlined him in silver, catching in his hair, revealing a tiredness that was not weakness, but consequence. His coat was immaculate again, his cravat tied with care, yet the composure he wore could not disguise what lived in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for coming last night." Winifred's hands were folded in her lap, steady by sheer will. "I did not come for your mother. I did not come for the county. I came because you spoke my name, without shame." His throat worked as if he were swallowing a truth too large. "I should have done it years ago." She looked at him, and tenderness rose like a tide she had fought for too long. "You did it when it mattered, when it cost you." "It has cost me," he admitted, "and it may cost more." Winifred's expression did not change, but her breath caught. "Your mother will not stop." "No," he said, and there was steel beneath the softness. "She will not. Which is why I must finish what began the moment you stopped waiting." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out a thick bundle of papers tied with twine. He placed them on the small table near the fire, as though laying down a weapon. "I have spent these weeks reading my father's ledgers," he said. "Not the versions Mother allowed me to see, the true accounts." Winifred's gaze drifted to the papers. "What did you find?" His jaw tightened. "The truth about the estate's debt. The truth about why she wanted to bind me to a dowry, and the truth about what has been hidden for years behind polished manners and charitable speeches." She did not speak. She waited, because she had learned that some truths demanded silence to be heard. Ernest turned the first page with careful fingers. "My father did leave debts," he said, "but they are not as impossible as Mother has claimed. Some are legitimate. Improvements he funded, tenants he aided, obligations he took on for people who could not defend themselves. Those debts can be managed. They can be settled with honesty and time." Winifred's stomach tightened. "And the rest?" He looked up, his eyes grim. "The rest is manipulation. The worst of it is not ruin. It is control." Her lips parted. "Control?" Ernest's hand pressed against the paper, as if it pained him to touch it. "Mother has been drawing funds into private accounts for years under the guise of protection. She exaggerated the estate's peril to force me into a marriage arrangement. She made herself indispensable by creating crises only she could solve." The room seemed to cool despite the fire. Winifred's voice was barely a whisper. "That is monstrous." "It is desperate," he said, and the sorrow in his tone surprised her. "And it is also wrong." He drew another document from the bundle and held it toward her. "This is a draft contract," he said, "the arrangement with Miss Harrow's family. It was not merely an understanding. It was a binding promise Mother began to formalize without my consent." Winifred's fingers hovered near the page, but did not take it. "You refused it." "I did," he said. "And her anger has not been only pride, it has been fear. If she loses control of the narrative, she loses the power she has built in the shadows." Winifred's gaze hardened with clarity. "And that is why she attacked my reputation, the paper, the lies." Ernest nodded slowly. "Yes." A silence pressed between them, heavy with all that had been done in the name of propriety. Winifred's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "So what happens now?" Ernest stepped closer, and the distance between them felt suddenly sacred. "Now," he said, "I tell the truth not only about you, but about this house, about the debts, about the manipulation. I will meet with the solicitor. I will meet with the creditors. I will speak to the tenants myself." Winifred's throat tightened. "You will bring your mother's wrath down upon you completely." He gave a faint, weary smile. "She already has." Winifred rose from her chair, the hem of her simple day gown brushing the rug. She moved to the window, watching the snow glow pale under the morning. Her reflection in the glass looked older than it had a year ago, as if waiting had stolen seasons from her. "Ernest," she said, not turning, "you have always been capable of grand feeling, but this is a war." "It is," he agreed. and I am not asking you to fight it for me." She turned then, and her eyes were bright, but dry. "Then what are you asking?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "To let me fight it for you." Winifred's breath caught in her chest. "I do not want to be a reason you lose everything." "You are not the reason," he said firmly. "My cowardice was the reason, my silence, my willingness to be ruled by fear. You are not the fire that burns my life down, Winifred. You are the light that shows what must be cleared away." Her lashes trembled, and she looked down, because she could not bear the intensity of his devotion when it was finally spoken without restraint. "Come with me," he said softly. "To where?" "To the chapel," he said. "Not to be married today, not yet, but to stand there where my father's name has been blessed and mourned, and to tell you in daylight what I should have told you before I ever dared to touch your hand." Winifred's heart pounded. "Why the chapel?" "Because I want no more shadows," he said. "No more corners, no more half-lives." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, with a steadiness that felt like surrender and strength at once, she nodded. "All right." They walked through the manor as if through a corridor of listening ghosts. Servants paused in doorways, faces carefully blank. Portraits watched them from gilded frames. Yet Ernest did not quicken his step. He did not lower his head. He walked beside Winifred with an unmistakable claim, not of possession, but of honor. Outside, the cold kissed Winifred's cheeks. The chapel stood on a rise at the edge of the grounds, ancient stone softened by snow. The door creaked open, releasing a scent of candle wax and old wood. They entered. The world inside was hushed, the kind of hush that made every breath feel like confession. Ernest closed the door behind them. Winifred's gaze moved over the pews, the small altar, the stained glass that caught the morning light and broke it into subdued color. She felt suddenly very small. Ernest stepped in front of her, his face open in a way she had never seen when the world watched. "I am going to say this plainly," he began. Winifred's fingers curled into her palms. "Say it." He exhaled, and his voice dropped low, intimate, steady. "I love you." The words did not sound like drama here. They sounded like truth. Winifred swallowed, her eyes fixed on his. "Say it again." His gaze softened with something almost reverent. "I love you, Winifred Harcourt. Not as a secret. Not as a comfort I borrow when the world allows it. As my wife. As the woman I will stand beside when they speak. As the woman I will defend when they lie." Her breath shuddered. "You cannot defend me against everything." "I can defend you against my silence," he said, "and that is the first battle." Winifred's eyes finally filled, but the tears did not fall. She was too full of feeling to allow them to reduce her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, voice trembling. He stepped closer until she could feel the warmth of him through the air. He did not touch her, not yet. He gave her the dignity of choice. "I want you to choose me," he said. "Not because I chased you on a road, not because I made speeches in a ballroom. Choose me because you believe I will keep choosing you when it is difficult." Or Winifred stared at him, and for a moment she saw the years like a ribbon unspooling behind her. Every day she had waited. Every night she had tried to be grateful for scraps of affection. The waiting had shaped her into someone strong, but it had also made her wary. She lifted her chin. "Then prove it to me now." His brows drew together. "How?" "Not with words," she said quietly. "With truth. Go to your solicitor today. Bring the ledgers. Confront your mother with evidence. Speak to the creditors. Make the estate's future clean and honest. And then come to me, not as a man pleading for forgiveness, but as a man who has built a life he is not ashamed to offer." Ernest listened, as if every syllable mattered. Then he nodded once, slow and solemn. "I will." Winifred's breath trembled. "And when you do—" He stepped closer again. This time his hand lifted, careful, and he brushed his knuckles along her cheek as though touching something precious. "When I do," he whispered, "I will ask you to marry me in front of God, in front of the county, in front of anyone who ever dared to think you were unworthy." The gentleness of his touch unmade her. Winifred's hand rose, and her gloved fingers settled lightly on his wrist, not pulling him away, not clutching him, only holding him in place, as if she needed to be certain he was real. "Ernest," she whispered, "I do not want revenge." "I do not want revenge either," he said. "I want peace. But not peace purchased by your silence." Her gaze searched his, and she found no hesitation there, only devotion. "All right," she breathed. "Then I choose you, but I choose myself too." His eyes closed briefly, as if the words were a prayer answered. When he opened them again, he looked at her as though she were dawn after a long night. "That is exactly the kind of love I want," he whispered. "A love that does not vanish inside obedience." They left the chapel together, and the snow outside seemed brighter, the sky clearer. Yet the day's hardest confrontation waited behind the manor's doors. In the study, the solicitor arrived before noon. Mr. Pembroke was a thin man with careful eyes, the sort of man who had survived in noble households by noticing every crack in the plaster. Ernest laid the ledgers before him without preamble. "I want you to read these," Ernest said, "and I want you to tell me what is lawfully mine to correct." Mr. Pembroke's gaze sharpened as he leafed through the pages. His expression shifted from professional neutrality to stunned concentration. "My lord," he said slowly, "these accounts, these transfers, are irregular." Ernest's voice was calm, but it carried iron. "Then we will make them regular. We will reconcile what is legitimate, and we will expose what is not." Winifred sat quietly to the side, her hands folded, observing. She felt the strange intimacy of it, being present not as a secret but as a witness. Ernest did not hide her. He did not excuse her presence. He simply allowed the room to understand that she belonged in his life. When the solicitor finally looked up, his face grave, he said, "Her ladyship will not welcome this." Ernest's gaze did not flicker. Her welcome is no longer required. By late afternoon, the dowager was summoned to the study. She entered with her usual dignity, dressed in black velvet now, as though mourning had become her newest weapon. Her eyes moved to Winifred with restrained contempt. "This is inappropriate," she said coldly. "I will not discuss family matters before the woman I love," Ernest interrupted quietly. "Then you should have thought of that before you used her name as a shield for your schemes." The dowager's eyes flashed. "Schemes." Ernest slid the ledger across the desk, stopping it in front of her gloved hand. "Explain these transfers." For the first time in years, silence did not belong to her. She stared at the pages, and something, fear perhaps, tightened around her mouth. "This is none of your concern," she said. "It is my concern," Ernest replied. "It is the estate's concern. It is the tenant's concern. It is my future. And it is her honor." The dowager's voice lowered, dangerous. "You would disgrace me." "I would correct you," Ernest said. "There is a difference." Her gaze cut to Winifred again. "You have poisoned him against his own blood." Winifred rose slowly. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room with the steady strength of someone who had survived a long injustice. "I did not poison him," she said. "I only refused to be the price you demanded for his obedience." The dowager's expression tightened, but the solicitor cleared his throat, reminding her that pride did not alter numbers. The confrontation lasted less than an hour, but it felt like the end of a reign. By the time it was over, the dowager had been forced into a choice: accept oversight and accountability, or face exposure in court and society. She left the room rigid, her breath shallow, her dignity intact only because Ernest allowed it. He did not want to destroy her. He wanted to end her control. When the door closed behind her, Ernest's shoulders sagged for the first time all day. He turned to Winifred, the firelight catching in his eyes. "It is done," he said softly. "Not all of it, but enough to begin." Winifred stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You did not flinch." "I could not," he whispered. "Not with you watching." Her hand rose, and this time she touched his cheek, bare skin, warm and real. The gesture was small, restrained, trembling with all it contained. "I am not afraid of the county," she whispered. "I am afraid of losing myself again." "You will not," he said, and his hand closed gently around hers, holding it against his face, as if it were the only safe thing left in the world. "You will stand beside me as you are, whole, and I will love you as you deserve, in daylight." Outside the study windows, the snow began to melt at the edges, tiny threads of water slipping down the glass like the last tears of winter. And as evening fell, Ernest escorted Winifred to the front steps of Ashford Manor, where the servants stood at a respectful distance, pretending not to watch while witnessing everything. He did not kiss her. Not there. Not as spectacle. Instead, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the knuckles of her glove. Slow, reverent, a vow made without excess. "Soon," he murmured, and then, as if he understood the danger of that word, he corrected himself with a softness that broke her. "Not soon," he whispered. "Now. I will build the life. I will ask you properly, and I will never ask you to wait in silence again." Winifred's eyes shone. Her voice was barely audible. "Then I will be here," she said. "Not waiting, choosing." He held her gaze as if memorizing it for all the years they had lost. And in the pale, honest light of winter's end, love finally stopped being a secret and became a future. The year was 1830, and the Cotswolds looked almost the same as they had a decade before. Rolling green hills, stone cottages warmed by ivy, the slow toll of the church bell marking the hours. Yet time had brushed its quiet hand across everything, softening some edges and deepening others. At the edge of the valley, Ashford Manor stood surrounded by orchards that bloomed earlier now, their branches heavy with promise. The grand house, once cold and proud, was alive again. The laughter of children drifted through open windows, mingling with birdsong and the clatter of the old clock that never quite kept time. Lady Winifred Ashford sat on the veranda, a book forgotten in her lap, watching the afternoon light dance through the leaves. Her hair had begun to turn the colour of honey in the sun, and faint lines traced her face, lines not of weariness, but of peace. Across the lawn, two children chased one another with shrieks of delight. The elder, Thomas, was 9, dark-haired and solemn-eyed like his father, though he laughed more freely. The younger Grace was 6 and endlessly curious, her curls as wild as the spring wind. "Thomas!" Winifred called, smiling. "Gentle with your sister, please." He turned, his grin as quick as sunlight. "Yes, Mama." She watched them run, her heart swelling with the kind of love that no longer hurt. From the far side of the garden, Ernest approached, his stride steady, his expression carrying the same quiet gravity that had always been his. He was no longer the restless man who had once ridden through storms. His hair was streaked with silver now, his face lined from laughter and worry alike, but his eyes, those grey-blue eyes that had once carried the weight of pride and sorrow, had softened into something infinitely kind. He carried a basket of apples and 2 letters tucked under his arm. "They're from the tenants," he said, placing them on the table beside her. "They've asked if you'll speak at the village school again next week." Winifred's lips curved. "They ask me every year, and every year I say yes. They've also asked if I might speak on estate management." She laughed softly. "You'll frighten them with ledgers and figures." "Then I'll make you read it for me," he said, leaning down to brush his lips across her temple. "They'll listen to you far more than to me." She tilted her head toward him, smiling. "You used to command rooms, my lord." He smiled back, eyes warm. "I learned better. Command earns obedience. Truth earns peace." Ndisab. Their hands found each other naturally, the gesture of people who had long forgotten what distance felt like. Inside the manor, the portraits that once watched in judgment now hung beside newer ones, paintings of laughter, of light, of family. The chapel had been restored, its doors always open to villagers who sought shelter or solace. The estate had recovered too, no longer a monument to pride, but a home built on fairness and work. Ernest had kept his vow. The tenants were partners, not subjects. The debts had been settled, the secrecy ended. The Dowager Marchioness lived still in a smaller house by the coast. She rarely visited. Her health had waned, but her pride never did. For years, she refused to speak of her son's marriage, but when Grace was born, a portrait arrived, painted in secret, unsigned, of a young mother holding her child by a window of light. No note accompanied it, but Winifred knew whose hand had commissioned it. Forgiveness, she had learned, often came disguised as silence. As for Mrs. Linton, she had moved to Bath, where she spent her final years surrounded by letters from the people she had once sheltered. Before she died, she sent Winifred a short note. "My dear, you have made courage look like grace. Never let the world convince you they are not the same." Duh. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Ernest and Winifred attended the winter festival in the village. The ballroom where their love had once been a scandal now welcomed them with open hearts. The same chandeliers gleamed above them, but the light felt warmer, less judgmental, as if memory itself had softened its edges. When the musicians began to play, Ernest offered his hand. "One waltz, Mrs. Ashford?" Winifred's eyes shimmered with laughter. "One waltz, my lord." They stepped onto the floor, their movements slower now, but no less graceful. Around them people smiled, the same people who had once whispered. Some had forgotten the scandal entirely, others remembered it only as the story of how courage can outlive gossip. As they danced, Winifred rested her head briefly against his shoulder. "Do you ever miss the man you were before all this?" He looked down at her, his voice quiet. "I would not trade the pain for ignorance, nor the loss for comfort. I miss only the time we wasted." She smiled faintly. "We've spent 10 years making up for it. And still, I want 10 more, he said. The music slowed, and they stopped, their hands still joined. Winifred lifted her gaze to him, the candlelight flickering in her eyes. "Then we shall have them," she said softly, "and if life is kind, perhaps more." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. The windows misted with the warmth of the crowd, the laughter of children echoing faintly from the hall beyond. When the night ended, they stepped out beneath the stars. The air was crisp, the snow glinting pale blue beneath the moon. Winifred slipped her arm through his, leaning into his warmth. "Do you remember that night? The one when you chased my carriage through the frost?" she asked. He smiled, the memory lighting his face. "I remember thinking I'd lost you forever." "And you nearly had," she teased. "I never would have stopped running," he said, "not until you looked back." She turned to him, her breath visible in the cold. "Then look at me now, Ernest. 10 years later, I am still here." He looked at her for a long time, his hand tightening around hers. "And I am still grateful." They stood in silence, watching the snow fall over the village, over the river, over the manor that had once been their battlefield and was now their home. In the distance, the church bell chimed midnight, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the beauty of what they had built, honesty, family, forgiveness, they understood something simple and eternal. Love had not been the prize of their struggle. It had been the reason for it. The wind stirred gently through the trees, carrying the faint laughter of their children inside the hall. Ernest drew Winifred close and whispered against her hair, "Our story was never meant to be perfect, only true." And beneath the endless sky of winter they stood together, no longer a marquis and the woman who defied him, but two souls who had learned, at last, how to keep what time could never take away. Every love story leaves a mark, but this one, of Winifred and Ernest, reminds us of something timeless, that love is not about waiting endlessly for someone to change, but about having the courage to walk away until they do. It teaches us that truth and dignity are the foundations of any lasting bond, and that when love returns, freed from fear and pride, it becomes something unbreakable. Their journey showed us that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, and that redemption often blooms in the quiet choices made after heartbreak. We watched a woman who found her voice and a man who learned to listen. Together, they rebuilt not just a home, but a life shaped by honesty, respect, and the bravery to love in daylight. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what moment moved you the most. And to let me know you stayed with Winifred and Ernest until the very end, write the word daylight below. Because their love began again, not in shadows, but in light. If you wish to help us continue bringing these emotional historical romances to life, you can send a super thanks in any amount you'd like. It truly helps the small team behind these stories keep creating. And if that's not possible right now, you can still support us by sharing this video with a friend who loves period dramas as much as you do. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for keeping romance alive with us. Don't forget to explore the other stories linked in the cards, each one written with the same passion, the same emotion, and the same belief that love, no matter the century, can still change everything.